Good morning, Washington, D.C. time zones. Good afternoon, European time zones. Good evening, Asian time zones. And welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm Adam Posens, the Institute's president, and we're very pleased today to be in partnership with the British to host an infrastructure and markets. We are very pleased to have such a distinguished panel to start this discussion. This event is on the record, and we welcome pre-registered participants on Zoom to pose questions using the Q&A function. We will gather those questions and put them to our panelists at the end of their prepared remarks. To introduce our panel, let me go in the order in which they will be speaking. First will be Kevin Stiroh, who is Senior Advisor to the Division of Supervision and Regulation at the Federal Reserve Board. He is leading the Federal Reserve supervisory work related to the financial risk of climate change and chairs the Supervision Climate Committee. Kevin has a long and distinguished career at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and in the Federal Reserve System, as well as numerous academic publications, and of course has played a key role in the Federal Reserve deciding to move in to climate change and green finance. Speaking second and representing the UK government is Emma Howard-Boyd. She is the chair of the Environment Agency, an ex officio board member of the UK Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and recently has been appointed as the UK Commissioner for the Global Commission on the Adaptation, 25 years in corporate finance and fund management. Speaking third is my colleague at Peterson, Jeff Schott, who is a senior fellow at the Institute and former co-chair of the Trade and Environmental Policy Advisory Committee for the U.S. Trade Representative. Jeff works on international trade policy and economic sanctions, and in particular is our expert on plurilateral trade agreements. During his tenure at the Institute, Jeff has also worked on issues of energy policy, on NAFTA, of course, and recently on CPTPP. He previously was a trade negotiator for the U.S., and he remains a member of the State Department's Advisory Committee on International Economic Policy. Our fourth speaker is Robert Tichio. Robert is a partner at Riverstone Holdings LLC, a major and leading investor in energy technology that first was in the fracking revolution and now is in the green revolution. He focuses on the firm's expanding efforts in environmental, social, governance practices, and sustainability investment platforms. He's led many of Riverstone's investments in exploration and production sector in private equity business, and we hope to hear his perspective on private sector actions to advance climate change adaptation, climate change technology. Prior to joining Riverstone, Mr. Tichio worked in private corporate equity investments at Goldman Sachs and at JP Morgan in the Mergers and Acquisitions Group. So now, if I could turn to Dr. Kevin Stiroh, please.
Good morning, and thanks very much, Adam, for the kind introduction. Can you hear me okay? Great, okay. I'd like to thank the Peterson Institute for the opportunity to speak on this timely panel. Climate change is clearly a topic of considerable and growing interest. At the Federal Reserve Board, Governor Brainerd, for example, recently spoke about the role that financial institutions might play in tackling the challenges of climate change. Today, I'll focus on the financial risks from climate change from a microprudential perspective. That is, the impact on specific institutions, particularly banks, and how firms are managing those risks. I'll begin broadly and then drill down to a few specific supervisory efforts, both domestically and internationally. So stepping back, from a supervisor's perspective, a primary goal is to ensure that banks operate in a safe and sound manner and manage the risks so they are resilient to a range of shocks. The core of effective risk management includes identifying, measuring, and managing traditional banking risks, like credit risk, market risk, operational risk, or liquidity risk. And these risks can materialize from a range of shocks: a recession, a geopolitical event, a bad actor, or climate change. And the purpose of supervision is to ensure that these firms are resilient to all of the risks. So from the bank's perspective, the impact of climate change can manifest in a number of ways. For example, the impairment of collateral due to severe weather events, mark-to-market losses from the devaluation of companies with stranded assets, stress to borrowers' cash flows as regional shocks are realized, or the reduction in the provision of financial services as business strategies adopt. All of these are salient concerns for financial firms and their supervisors, and we see large firms increasing their focus on these risks. And to be clear, financial firms themselves have every incentive to manage the risks to themselves. And we see firms incorporating these risks into their existing risk management frameworks and thinking about strategic opportunities with new and existing clients. Many firms are viewing climate change as a cross-cutting risk that impacts familiar bank risks and it broadly affects their risk management approaches. We also see firms considering governance issues, the use of scenario analysis, and disclosure options. Different firms are approaching physical and transition risks from different perspectives, and this depends on their business model and their geography. One common theme, though, is that the understanding of the financial risks from climate change comes with significant challenges, including a longer time horizon, data gaps, the need for new model development, and the inherent complexity and fundamental uncertainty. All of this suggests that there's much work ahead of us. And just as banks are building their capacity, the international supervisory community is also developing capacity in this area. As Adam mentioned, the Federal Reserve recently established a system-wide supervision climate committee, and I'm chairing this with broad representation and collaboration from across the system. The goal of this committee is to ensure that supervised firms are resilient to climate-related financial risks. And we'll do this by first assessing the risks and then considering if changes to the supervisory program are needed to ensure that firms are appropriately taking risk management frameworks. Of course, any changes to the supervisory program would be appropriately tailored to the size, complexity, and geographical differences across supervised firms. And to be clear, at this point, we do not yet have any views on whether additional supervisory or regulatory actions are needed. An important part of our agenda is to engage with a wide range of stakeholders, including supervised institutions, consumer groups, academics, data providers, all in order to better understand the issues and challenges that financial firms face. So discussions like this one are an important part of our work program. One specific area of interest is to strengthen our understanding of how firms are actually developing their internal capacity to measure, manage, and ultimately mitigate climate-related financial risks. We also want to understand the challenges that the firms face in these areas. And as I said, data and models are one clear challenge. And then we'll develop our own internal analytical framework, tools, and models to better assess these risks. And we're still in early stages of this process. I'll turn now to an international perspective. The Basel Committee on Banking Supervision is the international standard setting body for banks. And the committee has noted that climate change may result in both physical and transition risks that impact the safety and soundness of individual institutions and could have broader financial stability implications for the banking system. So in response, the Basel Committee established the Task Force on Climate-Related Issues. And I'm acting as co-chair as executive board member of the ECB and chair of the Network for Greening the Financial System. In the first phase of our work, we conducted a stock take of members' existing regulatory and supervisory initiatives on climate-related financial risks. And to take the work forward, we've been following a gradual and sequential approach from a supervisory perspective. First, building a strong analytical foundation, and then turning to an assessment of potential tools. We have benefited enormously from a series of workshops with global banks last year, and we're finalizing 2 analytical reports, one on transmission channels from the changing climate to the economic and financial sectors to the potential risks for banks, and second on measurement methodologies, how supervisors and banks are trying to measure these risks. And these These reports are expected to be released by the middle of 2021. Then, building on the analytical reports, we'll consider the extent to which climate-related financial risks are incorporated into the existing Basel framework risks. Your expectations related proceed in a thoughtful way with broad engagement and transparency. It's clear to me that we have considerable work ahead of us, and this conclusion reflects, in part, the observation that understanding the financial risks of climate change is both a complex problem and a complicated one. It's complex in the sense of many interconnections and feedback loops, the likely existence of nonlinearities and tipping points, and massive uncertainty about key factors like the timing of climate impacts, policy choices, technology change, and the adaptive responses of consumers and businesses. And all of this tests our ability to understand and manage the risks. At the same time, it's a complicated problem from an implementation perspective. Success will require analysis of vast amounts of granular data and aggregation across business lines, sectors, and geographies. It will require the development and implementation ongoing collaboration between the private and public sectors to push the industry towards greater resilience to the financial risks of climate change. Thank you all for your attention today, and I look forward to a productive discussion.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Let us now turn to Emma Howard Boyd. Ms. Boyd, please.
Thank you, Adam, and hopefully you can hear me today. And thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's fantastic, and I'm very honoured to be joining you at today's panel discussion. In last July, President Joe Biden said, "When I hear the words climate change, I hear the word jobs." In November, Prime Minister Boris Johnson published a 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, mobilising £10 billion worth of investment and supporting up to 250,000 British jobs to achieve net zero. We have shared goals. The Environment Agency, which I chair, manages floods and droughts in England and is part of the International Network for Storm Surge Barriers, or ISTORM, alongside the US Army Corps of Engineers and others. ISTORM allows authorities operating storm surge barriers to peer review each other's work and share best practice. The Thames Barrier and its associated defences in London protect over 1.4 million people and 500,000 properties worth over £321 billion. ISTORM shows that international collaboration is extremely valuable, even when it comes to unique place-based climate challenges. Storm surge barriers are important for protecting hubs of economic activity, but that economic activity itself has a role to play. In 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said, "We have 12 years industrial levels." In 2019, the insurance giant Aviva measured investments in its equities portfolios against the goals of the 2015 Paris Agreement and found that they were on track for 3.4 degree rise, and the FTSE 100 index as a whole was heading towards 3.9 degrees. For many people who are investors, mainly via pensions, this looks like a catch-22. You need to save, yet your savings are contributing to a world that will be much less hospitable by the time you retire. But things are changing fast. Earlier this month, the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change launched a framework to help global investor groups align their portfolios with net zero. The launch saw 22 asset owners with $1.2 trillion in assets, joining a number of others already working on net zero alignment. This means 38 investors managing $8.5 trillion in assets are already putting the framework to practical use. Stephanie Pfeiffer, CEO of IIGCC, said the global investment community has been called on to play its part in the transition to net zero, and it is answering that call. Another initiative led by the filmmaker Richard Curtis, called Make My Money Matter, is encouraging people in the UK to make sure their pension reflects their values. Moving to a more sustainable fund can have 27 times as much impact in reducing your carbon footprint than giving up flying and becoming a vegan combined. That doesn't mean that those choices are 27 times less important, far from it. But the Make My Money Matter campaign has found out that 68% of UK savers want their investments to consider people and planet alongside profit. The Financial Times reports that according to Morningstar financial data, global environmental, social and corporate governance linked funds took in nearly $350 billion last year, compared with $165 billion in 2019. It said net assets held in UK domiciled ESG funds went from 29 billion at the beginning of 2017 to 71 billion by the end of 2020, including active and passive funds. But what does that mean on the ground? It means we need to both reduce carbon emissions and take action to prepare for physical impacts. Let's start with one vast, complex and vital global industry. Construction is one of the biggest emitters of carbon worldwide, but many in that industry would say that their clients' priority is bringing costs down, not taking climate action. But no one who works in construction wants to build wind turbines that freeze in a Texas ice storm or build energy-efficient homes that wash away in an Australian flood. They want to build things that last. Do you remember the Oscar ceremony when Frances McDormand won Best Actress for 3 billboards outside Ebbing, Missouri? She proposed actors should demand an inclusion rider. I propose everybody should demand a climate emergency rider. If you are commissioning any work from any industry, you should ask how that work is actively reducing carbon emissions and how it is resilient to the coming shocks, like storms and heat waves. If the answer is the technology hasn't been invented yet, that's not good enough. A business that pins all their hopes on the R&D department is a risky investment. Greta Thunberg has talked about cathedral thinking, and that means we must lay the first stone without knowing exactly how to construct the ceiling. At the Environment Agency, we are using our activities and supply chain as a laboratory to find new ways to reach net zero, such as how low carbon concrete can be used for flood defences. This helps us protect people from climate shocks, and it reduces our carbon footprint at the same time. If the whole industry began using low carbon concrete, and I predict that they will, the carbon reductions would be huge. But the most successful companies can't afford to wait for everyone else. They will get ahead of that trend and raise the bar. Bill Gates said that the climate emergency is even more difficult to manage than coronavirus. Some organizations, like the Environment Agency, are working with behavioral psychologists to help us overcome the natural human barriers that get in the way. It will expose vulnerabilities and requires courage. But consider this. In Bangladesh, deaths from tropical cyclones declined more than 100-fold in 40 years, from 500,000 deaths in 1970 to just over 4,000 in 2007. This was made possible by developments in early warning systems, cyclone shelters, evacuation plans, coastal embankments, reforestation schemes, and increased awareness and communication. We need to mobilize the finance industry to get behind change on the ground. The Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment was launched in 2019 and has 3 co-chairs: John Haley, CEO of the Anglo-American insurance company Willis Towers Watson, Samir Asaf from HSBC, and I'm there representing the public sector as well. By pricing climate risks, particularly for infrastructure, and including them in upfront financial decision-making, our aim is to incentivize a shift towards greater resilience. The state of California recently joined the coalition, and members now have over $11 trillion in assets. That is what is needed, trillions. In the UK government's recent budget, our Chancellor confirmed the creation of a new national infrastructure bank. It will have £22 billion of financial capacity and is expected to support at least £40 billion of investment in infrastructure projects. And one of its core objectives will be to help tackle climate change. Green banks are critical. They allow countries access to foreign and domestic climate finance while enabling domestic ownership of project development and alignment with the Paris Agreement. Research from the Rocky Mountain Institute, the Natural Resources Defence Council, and in the UK, the Green Finance Institute, has shown that there are 27 operational green banks in 12 countries that have invested over $25 billion of their own capital and attracted twice as much from the private sector into low carbon and resilient projects. UK and US support for the expansion of national green banks would demonstrate a commitment to green recovery globally and would help establish a world-leading platform that provides international support. There is extraordinary economic opportunity in tackling the climate crisis and restoring nature. But to underpin this, we need strong environmental regulation. If polluters don't pay, the best intentions of the best performers will be undermined and undercut. Environmental regulation needs to be in lockstep with economic and financial regulation, outpacing climate change and matching the scale of the challenge. Environmental regulation, through its example, enforcement, monitoring, and metrics, can support profitable green industry both at home and demonstrate market effectiveness everywhere so that no country and no one gets left behind. The United States and the United Kingdom should be united in getting the whole world investing in restoring nature, restoring carbon emissions, preparing for shocks, and creating the jobs of the future. As we approach the G7 and COP26, let's together kickstart a global race to the trillions of dollars needed to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emma, for making time to join us today when so much is on the UK government's plate in COP26 and the G7. Just to remind our registered audience members, you are able to submit questions to any or all of the panelists using the Q&A function on Zoom. You can also email to the meetings group at Peterson Institute. Let me now turn to my colleague, Jeff Schott. Jeff.
Thank you very much, Adam. Climate change is undoubtedly the world's most existential environmental problem. And my responsibility on this panel is to talk about what trade policy has to do with it. Right now, the World Trade Rules contain broad exceptions for measures supporting environmental objectives, but they also include authorities to allow countries to impose countervailing duties and other measures to counter the subsidies that may support the promotion of renewable technology in other countries. So there is a conflict in the World Trade Rules. National policies to counter greenhouse gas emissions involve a mix of regulation and subsidies and tax measures that affect production costs, but they also can distort international trade and investment. And the trading rules really need to be updated to take account of the important challenges that the previous speakers have talked about. Different national policies raise concerns about level playing field. And that often sparks demands in politics in various countries for offsetting duties against alleged unfair trading practices via anti-dumping and countervailing duties or other border adjustment measures. So what can trade policy contribute to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions? The first thing I think, and it's already on the plate of the WTO, World Trade Organization, is to promote the diffusion of green technologies by lowering trade barriers on products subject to tariffs in the major trading countries. This is, in the near term, something that is doable. The WTO countries were on the verge of an agreement back in December of 2016 on a small list of products, about 54 products, where tariffs would be reduced to zero, but opening up more access to markets abroad and allowing the access to the most advanced environmental technologies. This needs to be revisited. It is something that could be done before the next WTO ministerial meeting in Geneva in late November. But it needs to be improved upon what was on the table back in December of 2016. It needs to have a provision that allows it to be a living agreement, to update regularly the products on the list so it keeps up with new emerging technologies. This is something that hopefully WTO members can have as a capstone of their meeting in November of this year. The second point is that the subsidy rules need revision. First, they need to encourage investment in clean energy infrastructure and to allow subsidies to support deployment of carbon abatement technologies in energy generation and transport in particular. Those are two areas where the most emissions arise are generated in the major economies, the United States, China, and others. And so you need to tackle that issue head on. This means creating in the trading rules a safe harbor to allow the governments to help assist building the infrastructure, the production and distribution networks so vital for incentivizing investments in renewable energy technologies and resources. This is not a theoretical issue. This is a problem that already exists. We have had in the development of the solar industry, countervailing duties, countering subsidies for the development of solar panels. And it has led to a lot of distortions in production and trade and misuse of resources that are needed to fight climate change. So that's one area of subsidy involvement. Another area of subsidy involvement is the need to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. This seems like an easy thing to do until you realize the income consequences, particularly in developing countries, where fossil fuel subsidies are often a part of basic income support for poor people. This is why the WTO needs to work in conjunction with the World Bank to develop a means to ensure that poor countries have the requisite technical and financial assistance to offset the burdens caused on low-income people in their economies. But it's a commitment that should be made, and the more developed countries should take this charge and implement it immediately. Third, and very troubling in the near future, is the question of carbon border adjustment mechanisms. These have been proposed to level the playing field with countries that do not have comparable climate policies. But how does one assess comparability? And that's the big problem. Does one look at the set of climate policies? Does one focus on a carbon tax or energy efficiency standards, clean energy subsidies, emission trading schemes? There isn't an agreed set of standards on which to guide what are comparable standards that all countries, or a minimum level of policies that all governments must implement in order to be approved for good climate policies. And this is something that needs to be worked out before there can be an introduction of carbon adjustment measures. Otherwise, there is a concern that those measures will be captured by political lobbies more interested in protection of their industries than in environmental protection. So it is a valid objective, but one that requires a great deal of preparation before countries should be going forward with carbon border adjustment measures. And the one thing that in the trading system that I would recommend is that countries take a time out and declare a moratorium for a year or so to provide time for consultations among the major emitters so that they can develop this common set of policies. That is, I think, critical for having a cooperative approach to climate going forward and preventing trade frictions from inhibiting the needed cooperation that is required between the United States and Europe, between the United States and the United Kingdom, even between the United States and China. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Jeff. You covered a great range of issues, very practical and very pressing. Thank you for taking that on. The purpose of this panel, as must be obvious, is to bring important issues to the fore, not to settle them, but to give our viewers, our participants, a sense of the state of play. In that spirit, we felt it very important to have a private sector investment voice in the technology sphere as well, referencing some of the things Emma has made reference to. For that, I turn to Robert, please.
Sorry, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate the invitation to have joined. What I will say is as follows. Just by way of background, Riverstone Holdings, we are based here in New York with offices in New York, Houston, London, Mexico City, and Menlo Park. I have been at the firm for 15 years, and I focus today on what we call our decarbonization growth equity platform, which is advancing investments in low carbon businesses that, in our view, are required spots for capital formation over the course of the next decade so that the global economy can meet the goal of capping temperature rises by 1.5 degrees by 2100. We have identified 6 core areas or verticals that are deserving of capital, where we believe in aggregate capital spend will approach $3 trillion across these 6 categories in the next 10 years. They include the electrification of transport, which is not just electric vehicles, but the entire ecosystem around electrification, which includes electric vehicle batteries and charging infrastructure. The second is what we call the greening of fossil fuels. That category is an implicit and explicit recognition that fossil fuel, the existing framework, will be with us for some period of time, whether it's 30, 50, or 100 years. It isn't going away tomorrow. And so businesses that advance programs such as methane leak detection or leak capture are critically important to reduce the carbon footprint of the existing fossil fuel network. The third platform is grid flexibility and resilience, where we are large believers that as the electric grid, particularly in North America, becomes more base loaded with renewables, that being wind and solar, the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, as we saw in Texas over the course of the last several months. And we need investments in platforms such as artificial intelligence and utility grade and level energy storage in order to meet power needs so that the public can expect reliable power, which is critically important. The fifth segment is agriculture. Agriculture is the 4th largest greenhouse gas emitting sector globally. There is no path to net zero by 2100 without going through agriculture. We are investing in businesses that are advancing programs in water treatment and waste management, even in companies that are advancing seed development so that poor and underserved farmers can still be able to farm land that becomes more dry and arid over the course of the next 15 to 20 years. The fifth space is what we call next generation liquid fuels, such as renewable diesel and hydrogen. It is our view that electrification and batteries will not solve and will not be the use case solution for every mode of transportation. Categories such as aviation, shipping, and heavy duty transportation simply do not have a near-term pathway for decarbonization through batteries. Or if they do, the breakthroughs are so fantastically far away that we need nearer term solutions. And then the 6th category where we're focused is what we call next horizon resource use optimization. which is a clumsy but large term that's largely focused on finding ways for the individual consumer to reduce his or her carbon footprint. Those examples are animal versus plant protein consumption, smart buildings, smart metering, smart cities, to enable the individual to reduce their footprint. I'll just close by saying, Adam, or these remarks by saying, it is our view that private capital absolutely needs to rise to the challenge to participate in almost a global and a coordinated basis to scale up capital for green solutions. I think that the remarks that were made both by Emma and by Jeff around the cost of that, the embedded costs and questions around subsidies needs to be addressed and needs to also be elevated publicly, because our view, having been in the fossil fuel network for some period of time, is we're not having an adequate conversation with technologies. We're not having a conversation around the total cost of an existing fossil fuel and carbon network. It's not just the cost of the delivered fuel or the delivered power source, but it's the ancillary costs for questions like health, soil erosion, property damage insurance, none of which is really captured in today's conversation when we're comparing costs. So with that, I'll close my opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Robert. These kinds of specific reality checks on technology, both optimistic and limits, are really important for us to take into account. I would like to just turn to Emma first, because I know she has to go in a minute. Two questions coming from the audience. One, just simply, what is the title of the green banking report you mentioned earlier? In your remarks, you referred to a green banking report.
I referred to some research that the Green Finance Institute and the Rocky Mountain Institute have pulled together on green banks. I don't have the precise title of that research, but I'm very happy to post it to you so that you can post it out. Yeah. Apologies.
No, not at all. The next question, which will go to you, and then after you reply, we may ask some of our other panelists to respond, is we're getting a lot of questions on this issue of the practice of standardizing pricing and carbon costs. For example, Barack Arzova says, I think that the IFRS set is insufficient to report the effects of climate change. Do you believe the new standards are needed for climate change reporting? How can we force companies to report the effects of climate change in their financial reports? Obviously, this is something that Kevin and Robert would have comments on as well, but this issue of standards, both across borders and across companies for reporting, how do you see that, Emma?
So it's been really important to see the developments of things like the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures, and in the UK, there is a move towards that becoming mandatory, and many of my former colleagues from the financial services sector, from the banking sector, have been calling for mandatory reporting for quite some time. I think it's also important to recognize that if we're dealing with climate, we need to go beyond carbon. So again, I've been personally very supportive of the development of further metrics which are nature related, will bring in things like water, nature recovery, etc. I think what has to happen in conjunction with greater transparency, though, so what we call greening finance, is the actual financing of green, which is putting the capital markets and capital to work in the solutions that we required. So very interested to hear what Robert was talking about, his particular strategy, firm strategies, not just carbon focused, but looking at agriculture and. We need both of these things to work in conjunction. So it's net zero reduction, looking beyond carbon, but also making sure that we're investing and analysing the growing climate shocks that we're experiencing around the world. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. I now have to disappear for another meeting, but hope the rest of the conversation goes well. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Let me now turn to Kevin Robert. We also have an accumulation of trade questions, which are directly to Jeff Schott. I'll turn to him next. But If I could ask Kevin and Robert to say a bit more about this issue of standards and accounting, from both both of you have a window into the financing of corporate activities and how investors and lenders treat them. So if maybe Kevin and then Robert could expand a little bit on how you think we move forward in this area, or maybe you think we already have the standards we need. Kevin?
I think the question of disclosure is an important one in the US. Issues around disclosure of material risks from an investor perspective is really the domain of the SEC, and they put out some comments about how they're thinking about this. From a supervisory perspective, one of the things that we've noticed is that many of the large banks have published voluntarily disclosures consistent with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, the TCFD, and that includes both their own contributions, but also importantly, estimates of financed emissions from their clients. And that's an important question about how to do that in a consistent, aggregatable, comparable way across institutions so that investors can make informed decisions about a given financial institution's footprint or contribution. So that's something I think we'll see more of going forward.
Great,
Yeah,
thank you. Robert,
the one remark I'd make about it, and in fact one of the questions, and perhaps it was posted prior to my remarks about the effects, the economic effects of climate change, I think are exactly the right questions to ask in terms of how to actually frame the analytics, because I think, as we all know, the concept and the reality of climate change is so politically charged. Although there's clearly been more developed consensus over the last several years than perhaps there was 10 years ago. There are deeply entrenched industries that want to either slow or deny the acceleration of capital transition to greener and cleaner industries. And oftentimes a tactic tends to be obfuscation, or tends to be redirecting people's information to data which is questionable. And so what I would say is, I think we are still struggling, Adam, for a broad, widely adopted, commonly accepted perspective on pathways to calculate and frame the economic cost of various interventions and various non-interventions. And I've said, in fact, one of the things that we've had conversations with our investors on as we contemplate bringing products to the marketplace around climate solutions is what we've noted is their intense interest, and this sits with universities, pension funds, endowments, high net worth individuals, their interest in quantifying and finding a way to frame. And you use the word accounting, I just use the concept of economic analysis, but framing either the benefits or the drawbacks to various competing technologies. Because I think people, investors for some period of time are really focused on the success of the technology, the success of asking the question, does it work? And now people are asking the question of, does it matter? Is it enough? And so I think those questions are still being examined by industry and by private capital. And I think that that's going to be a critical pathway to seeing what industries get stood up more quickly than others.
Thank you, Robert. Let me now turn to Jeff Schott. There are a number of questions that have come in around the multilateral versus plurilateral aspects of this. Dominic Hofstetter asked, do you see a trend in terms of greater climate risks increasing the move toward unilateral and bilateral rather than multilateral trade policies? Peter Rashish raises the possibility, assuming agreement on common and appropriate guidelines for how to tax carbon-intensive imports, could there be a US-EU or US-EU-UK agree-free trade area to move the process along? Julian Callow asks, is there time to allow the WTO to set up a committee to assess border tax adjustment? And Alessandro Antimilani of DG Trade at the EU says, the initiative to have duty-free for green goods at the WTO level implicitly require agree on a common set of green policies, with a green label in WTO be an option? I realize I'm lumping together many questions, but they're all under this heading of how much UK, US, EU collaboration versus how much WTO organized collaboration is the way forward here and how this interacts. So Jeff, what's your take?
Well, these are all very good questions. But my major concern is that at the foundation, we need to have a agreement or some coherence of transatlantic policies. And we don't have that right now. And in fact, we have a risk that the US and the European Union may increase friction over the impending European carbon border adjustment mechanism. And that's why I suggested there was a need for a moratorium so that we could develop the types of minimum standards that would allow some type of assessment of what are comparable climate policies and what would justify border adjustments. So we're not there yet. I think this also requires coordination between the United States and China, because we're the two biggest emitters. And this is one area where the United States and China actually could do something cooperatively together, because it's in our own interest to do that. But I think it's going to require a combination of ingredients: unilateral, bilateral, and WTO. I suspect the WTO channel is going to be clogged because a number of developing countries have opposed moving forward on anything less than a full participation of all the countries. So plurilateral agreements are being contested by India and South Africa in particular. And that's going to create problems. But I think moving forward in the WTO with what you can do immediately is useful to start a green agenda. But I suspect it's going to involve plurilateral agreements. The risk, and the final point here, the risk is countries start with unilateralism, and that's the risk of the Europeans instituting a carbon border adjustment mechanism without some consultations and cooperation with other major trading nations to ensure that this is not going to impose unjustified new restrictions on trade and investment.
Thank you, Jeff. Let me go back to, actually, there's a very good follow-up question to Jeff. From Andreas Schwarzenberg, given the disagreements between the US, China, EU, and others in the role of government in the economy, what do you think is the most likely path for updating or revising the WTO subsidies agreement?
Well, there, I think you have to start with what I was talking about. Do something on fossil fuel subsidies, because that's an area where the major advanced countries can do more sooner rather than later. I think there's also a need to create that safe harbor to facilitate the types of investments that Robert was talking about. And that safe harbor could be for a time-limited period. There was a precedent in the WTO in its first 5 years in the late 1990s for types of green box subsidies that allowed the use of subsidies for environmental purposes without a liability under countervailing duty laws. And I think we need to consider that, but in a more targeted fashion, to promote the investment in energy infrastructure, to promote the advancement of renewables.
Great. Let me close this out, picking up to both Robert and Kevin, and I'll give Kevin the last word if Robert's willing to go first. So we are moving into the COP26. For your work, respectively, as an investor, as a bank supervising financial regulator, what do you expect to come out of this meeting that will affect what you do? or will there be nothing in this meeting that affects what you do? Robert.
Well, first of all, I'm incredibly optimistic around COP26 and around the prospects for specifically greater conviction around certain preferred technologies and advancing them, certainly at the what I call supranational level, and then ultimately developing national policies. So we are increasingly focused on transport. If you were to ask where are the places that I spend most of my time, sort of quite literally up at night, staring at the ceiling, figuring out how we're going to solve, it's transportation and agriculture. And I do think that COP26 has a handful of working groups that and transportation and in the transportation and mobility leads specifically that I think are going to have the potential to have real either breakthrough commitments or expressions that can help galvanize national policy. So in terms of how it will change what we as investors do, and I'm just not saying the royal we, but we as our firm and our products, it won't meaningfully, because I think we have a certain degree of conviction as to where the world will go over the next 5 to 10 years, or where it has to go. And to some degree, that's what our investors expect of us, not necessarily to follow policy, but to try and imagine where it goes. So again, I don't think we'll pivot in any meaningful regard, but I do think that it has the potential to set the tone and particularly elevate certain technologies and decarbon pathways that potentially are living presently in the second or third tier.
Excellent. Thank you, Robert. Kevin, to you, representing the Federal Reserve.
Great, thanks. So from my perspective as a bank supervisor, our focus is really on whether or not supervised institutions continue to operate in a safe and sound manner. And that includes both the potential risks from climate change and also considering the potential opportunities. And we've definitely seen a change over the last few years as firms talk about their own voluntary disclosure consistent with the TCFD, as firms make their own voluntary commitments to align their portfolio to the Paris Agreement. And all of that is...
Kevin, I'm sorry, we keep losing you. Could you turn off your camera and let us hear your words, please?
From where things were a few years ago. Looking forward, I think we'll continue to engage with the firms and understand how they are approaching some of the risk management. So I'm sorry for the bad connection. Sorry, I'm not hearing you now, Adam.
No, sorry, I was hoping to hear you, Kevin, so I was staying quiet. Could you just, I appreciate your perseverance. Could you one more time just repeat the last few sentences of what you were saying?
I will try once more, apologies. So our focus is really on ensuring that firms are managing these risks. And we've seen a large change in how they're approaching some of these issues. So looking forward, we expect continued focus on this topic as firms think about both the risks and the opportunities over the next few years. Apologies for the technology problem.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And thanks to our audience. This is important content and we're doing the best we can in today's world. Let me close this. I don't think that there's much to say beyond getting Robert and Kevin's views on the COP26 implications and Jeff's views on the critical next steps on the trade front. Just to say that obviously these issues move forward. The Peterson Institute is committed to doing more convening and more research on this topic, not because it's hot, but because it's now ripe. And the issues that we in particular are concerned about in terms of where we can, concerned about in the sense of where we can make a contribution, we believe, are on these questions of political economy. What is the role of the central bank? What is the trade management agenda when there are potentially diverging paces of decarbonization across major actors? What is going to be, going to the point about economic costs, what is going to be the method from a political economy point of view of reallocating workers out of sectors and dealing with the cost changes to climate change, as Jeff mentioned, the issue of poorer people around the world being greatly dependent on energy subsidies. And I commend the IMF, which several years ago started to highlight that issue in an event at the Peterson Institute. And finally, of course, again, as referred to by Jeff and implicit in everyone's remarks, there is the divergence ethically, politically, and economically that many developing countries feel they are being cut out of their opportunity for cheap energy when the rich countries, or the already rich countries, have had their chance to burn through carbon. And that is both political and a historical reality that has to be navigated in a world where China and India and others, as Robert points out in the field of agriculture in particular, have a great effect on the whole world. So this is where the Peterson Institute hopes to make a difference in convening and research and writing and advocacy, because we now see, thanks to people like Kevin, Robert, Emma, who was with us earlier, we now see that the agenda is moving in the financial markets, in the investment community, in governments, in popular opinion. And we want to figure out how to get past those roadblocks. To get us to this point, I again want to thank Kevin Stiroh, Robert Tichio, my colleague Jeffrey Schott, and previously Emma Howard Boyd of the Environment Agency in the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs at the UK. We're grateful to the British Embassy for their partnership in bringing us together today, and we look forward to a successful conclusion of the upcoming COP26. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Adam. Bye.
Thank you.